Pues buenos días a todas y a todos. Vamos a dar comienzo a la primera mesa, que voy a ser bastante breve en la presentación porque dentro del propio título, que es Neoliberal Imaginaris, que es como todo el Congreso va de eso. Entonces, pues quizá por rescatar algo que pueda darle coherencia, que luego veremos dónde están los puntos en los que se unen, pues podríamos hacer una presentación a partir de 3 casos distintos que pueden resultar como ejemplificadores de algunos de los maneras de poder abordar estos imaginarios neoliberales. Y no me voy a adelantar un poco a sus presentaciones y paso directamente, voy a ir de una en una para no confundirnos. Ángela. Pues Ángela Harutyunyan es profesora asociada de Historia del Arte en la Universidad Americana de Beirut y directora del Departamento de Bellas Artes e Historia del Arte. Imparte cursos de Historia y Teoría del Arte Moderno y Contemporáneo. Es coeditora de la revista Art Margins y ha contribuido con ensayos sobre el arte y la cultura armenia, postsoviética, en revistas académicas y artículos críticos relacionados con las prácticas artísticas contemporáneas y la política cultural en Egipto y el Líbano. Y como se verá en su presentación, sus intereses de investigación incluyen el arte postsocialista de Europa del Este y la antigua URSS, el realismo socialista, el arte contemporáneo en el Medio Oriente, los métodos y teorías de las exposiciones, entre otros. Y voy a pararme aquí porque, bueno, tenéis todos el abstract, pero bueno, era por hacer un poco una presentación y que no se tenga en frío. Thank you, Angela. Y también quería recordar a los que no tenéis casquitos, que los que queráis la traducción del inglés, que hay casquitos fuera.
Is this fine? Yes, I guess so. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and to Anita for the coordination. It's my first real face-to-face conference since the pandemic has begun. And I'd like to present part of my research that has to do with not so much with neoliberalism as such, but what maybe we could call the contemporary as the spirit or the cultural logic of neoliberalism and global capitalism. So in a sense, tired with the outmoded debates on... maybe I'll switch to my presentation, so it's... Great. And tired with the outmoded debates on postmodernity from the 80s, more recent discussions on world historical periodization in art and critical theory have been increasingly engaged with interrogating the contemporary as the spirit or culture of neoliberal capitalism. The advent of the contemporary is coupled with the globalization of neoliberalism and market economy, and subsequently with a global turn in art since the 90s. Various authors such as Terry Smith, Peter Osborne, Alexander Albero, Pamela Lee, note that all of them come from art history and theory, situate contemporaneity at the watershed moment at the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the disintegration of the USSR in 1991. There's a general agreement that the contemporary marks a quality of historical time that is presentist in essence, and contemporary art both heralds and captures this presentism as a temporality emptied out of historical time itself. Thus, the assumption goes that the quality of our contemporary time is the ruptured time of the perpetual now that stands as infallibly singular, as what Terry Smith calls a permanent seeming aftermath. The temporality of neoliberal market economy itself, wherein the only future that exists is a fiscal one derived from insurability of all phenomena and perhaps even noumena. I argue that this presentist temporality, if considered from the Soviet historical experience, doesn't simply rise out of the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the globalization of neoliberalism. In the post-Soviet condition, presentism, characterizing contemporaneity, intertwines the disintegration of three temporal orders, the long processes of the disintegration of the Bolshevik revolutionary project, the Stalinist counter-revolution, what we could term perhaps, Stalinist presentism, defined by the freezing of the revolutionary dialectic in the space of the Soviet state as a permanent formation, and the neoliberal regime of temporality in the 90s, where time stands still in the order of deadlines, fiscal futures, exploitation of nature, and the looming planetary ecological catastrophe. In some of my writing, I argue that Stalinist presentism rhymed with neoliberal contemporaneity. It was to haunt the temporality of life in the Soviet Union beyond Stalinism. In Stalinist temporality, the Soviet state is the final harbor of the teleologically fulfilled history. The supposed completion of history in Stalinism is analogous to the supposed completion of history in late capitalism that triumphs in the 90s as a global condition. Thus, I make the argument that the post-Soviet contemporary was not simply born of the collapse of the USSR and its subsumption into a market economy, so much as an already existing arrest of revolutionary historical time in Stalinism was conjoined with the implementation of the neoliberal project. But if the post-historical ideology of the end of history declares history as such as fiction and narration, in Stalinism, the post-historical consciousness is arrived at in the name of history itself, and on the wings of dialectical materialism. The supposed triumph of history in Stalinism was anchored on the conception of the synchronicity between the means of production, the relations of production, and to a certain degree of consciousness that guaranteed the completion of socialism ratified in the 1936 Soviet Constitution. The completion of historical movement in the party state was to facilitate the identification of Stalinism with the Soviet experience. This identification was precisely what was taken up by the dissident intelligentsia that acquired a public platform during Gorbachev's programs of perestroika and glasnost in the 80s as a ghost to be expelled. To break from official orthodoxy, the semi-official and unofficial artists in the USSR sought a rupture from the permanent triumph of history, a breakthrough or escape to the other side of the curtain, to the consumer paradise of capitalist democracies. Perestroika's cultural and intellectual avant-garde imagined in the content of the new art the freedoms and lifestyle denoting all that was non-Soviet. In the styles, methods, and techniques that the official Soviet art criticism designated as bourgeois formalism, such as abstract expressionism, pop art, minimalism, objet trouvé, performance, and other forms repressed by socialist realist orthodoxy. Nevertheless, at the structural level, this new form of anti-Soviet art was soon, in the 90s, was to be institutionalized as contemporary. And it was prepared, this is what I argue, in the interstices of the Soviet experience and made visible because of the glasnost's and perestroika's calls for transparency and freedom of speech. And as such, it conforms to the Soviet dissident vision of a contemporary that exists on the other side of the Soviet historical experience in Western liberal democracies. So I consider contemporary art as symptomatic of the post-Soviet present, and one which is instituted through the exorcism of the Soviet or the Soviet experience as a ghost. In a sense, contemporary art encapsulates anti-Soviet consciousness, wherein the Soviet is identified with Stalinism. And from this perspective, late Soviet unofficial art of the perestroika period can be considered as the cultural vanguard of the era that was to come in the 1990s. The protests since 1987 in many of the republics of the Soviet Union and most actively in Latvia and in Armenia were spearheaded by perestroika's cultural and intellectual avant-garde. Some of them 1960s hippies that imagined the content of the new contemporary time in the contemporaneity, in the freedoms and lifestyles denoting the non-Soviet. It is here that to be of one's time, contemporary, came to be identified with being anti-Soviet, where the Soviet was seen as an already dead and calcified past that nevertheless lingers on. To be contemporary in the late Soviet and post-Soviet world means to treat the, as I mentioned before, his Soviet historical experience as a ghost to be expelled, and contemporary art here comes to be the key signifier of this relationship. So the Soviet as a signifier, with its identification with totalitarianism and ideological deception, haunted the practices of semi- and unofficial artists in the late Soviet years through recurrent returns of various invented and real personages born from the anti-Soviet consciousness. Sometimes these personages occupied the margins of official discourses, styles, forms, and techniques. At other times, they hid underground from the watchful eyes of Soviet collectivity. I'd like to maybe mention a few examples of the contemporary heroes of anti-Soviet underground. In the mid-80s, in St. Petersburg, Evgeny Yufit, Alexander Maslov, and several other artists, filmmakers, started a cinema movement that they named necrorealism. Yufit's productions, borrowing from the aesthetics of film noir, were based on various macabre rituals performed in nature by so-called specialists, be those party bureaucrats, doctors, or scientists. In these films, nature and bureaucracy come together in the uncanny figure of the undead dead. In Yufit's feature film, Father Frost is Dead, Papa Umir Ded Maroz of 1991, the dead are playing the living, playing dead. A city dweller, either a scientist or an engineer, a fact that can be discerned from his intellectual look and the way he struggles to give rational explanations to rather irrational phenomena, sets on a journey to the countryside to visit his supposed half-brother. Already on the way, he encounters living beings that look dead and dead beings that come to life. The coordinates of his known world disintegrate once he arrives to the village. First as an observer, then unwittingly as a participant, he encounters murder, incest, homosexuality that are equated with ideological perversion. Ideology is signified, especially in the, this is the character that travels to the countryside. Ideology is signified in the figures of men in suits who orchestrate macabre rituals. In Yufit's film, the only surety between the living and the dead is that only death does not die. But since death here is equated with ideology turned nature, the only survivor is ideology without recourse to any reality. The reversal of life and death is enacted in a happening also by a group of artists in 1998 in Soviet Armenia. Known as the Third Floor, these artists had initiated a cultural movement a year earlier that signaled what I consider the advent of contemporary art in Armenia within Perestroika's liberalization program. Inspired by Glasnost, a group of artists embarked upon the reformation of the local artists' union, which is a state structure of production and distribution of art. Ideologically, the Third Floor movement presents a mixture of romantic liberalism, nationalism, and libertarianism, with anarchist dreams of omnipotence and contradicting ideologies that often operated hand in hand. The artists participating in the movement actively appropriated Western signs, symbols, as well as modes of artistic production that were a mixture of high art and middle to lowbrow cultural icons. From Leonardo to Joseph Beuys to Black Sabbath and veneration of American blue jeans and Marlboro cigarettes, these were all symbols denoting the ideals of individual freedom and autonomy that were supposedly repressed by Soviet orthodoxy. On December 12, in 1988, several artists of the movement, dressed as resurrected ghosts, like their heavy metal heroes, the musicians from the groups Black Sabbath and Kiss, walked into one of the Union of Artists' conventional exhibitions and declared the death of official art. In this happening, recorded under two different titles, the official art has died, and hail to the Union of Artists from the Netherworld, they walked silently through the exhibition hall, viewed traditional paintings hung on the walls of an institution defending Soviet official orthodoxy, and with the realization of the symptomatic significance of their action, took photographs of themselves in various groupings and positions and walked out. In this action, if art was the collectively constructed dream of the underground heroes, the institution belonged to the properly dead and officially sanctioned reality. The dead heroes of the netherworld were more alive than what belonged to the official world above the ground. Through the metaphor of the netherworld, the third-floor artist strove to discover the pure, socially unconditioned freedom of a radically individualized subject who had managed to overcome and transcend the contaminating layers of ideology through artistic negation. The disappearing world of the Soviet historical experience supplied a negative content for the conception of art as a space of an ideology-free utopia, as a dream world, in a sense. The Soviet reoccurred in the haunted images of resurrected ghosts and authoritarian personages in other artists. One other example that I'd like to quickly refer to at the end of this presentation is Grigor Mikhailian, known as Kiki, a personage that he invented called Bobo. Bobo is an abstract and fictional character without a referent, whose name is commonly evoked to scare children. In Kiki's series of abstract paintings that he had been tirelessly producing since the 80s, Bobo is the Secret Service agent, the KGB officer, and the immaterial eye that controls. It is the scarecrow of the dissident intelligentsia. Bobo is also doubling at the linguistic level. It's a figure of a paradox, an image and an anti-image, a hero and an underground one, an abstraction, but a material one. This figure had to be constantly reconstituted, constantly in process. The artist still keeps on doing this action painting. It is not accidental that Bobo could only materialize through an action painting enacted on a canvas spread on the floor, with action painting and abstraction being prime signifiers of opposition to the Soviet and its cultural politics. The horizontally positioned canvas itself became a site of exorcism of the official and of the ideological, as the artist circled around it in mad movements and through scribbly brushstrokes, or rather broomstrokes, as Kiki would always use a broom, that favorite method of transportation for witches, on the surface with intense gestures. Thus, Bobo is a figure, or rather an anti-figure of official discourse. The canvas appears here as a space of psychic discharge upon which repressed demons are exorcised. Perestroika intended to overcome precisely these demons of the Soviet system and of Stalinism in particular through publicly orchestrated collective exorcism. However, this exorcism turned Soviet history into a double ghost. This history had already been rendered spectral by Stalinism, or the Bolshevik experience, let's say. Whereas Perestroika was fighting the ghost that had left the material body while deceiving its enemies with the empty shell that remained. It is rather telling that death, the netherworld, the uncanny cohabitation of the living and the dead as signifiers of the decaying communist project and the disintegrating Soviet ideology became frequent figures in the art practices of the Perestroika and post-Soviet periods. In a way, the post-Soviet 90s embodied the nightmare dreamed by the third-floor artists, a dream materialized in the triumph of neoliberalism that rendered the artists themselves as marginal in the new social order. Then contemporaneity as the presentist temporality of neoliberal capitalism in the post-Soviet context is an amalgam of different temporalities, temporal orders at first sight diametrically opposed. The disintegration of the Bolshevik project in the Stalinist territorialization of time in the Soviet state, something I don't have time to refer to or to go into today, the eternally recurring time of ethnocentric nationalism, and the permanent present of neoliberal globalization with its time management economy. In a way, the post-Soviet contemporary is the post-Stalinist living on of Stalinism. And here is like the Kardashian sisters in front of the monument of Mother Armenia in Yerevan, a monument that was erected during the de-Stalinization in the 50s, in the second part of the 50s, and it literally came to replace Stalin's statue. The pedestal remained the same, but the figure changed, marking his continuous presence, hovering above the city landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. I think we can go to Cristina and then we can gather the questions after. Introduce Cristina Catalina. Es profesora asociada en el Departamento de Filosofía y Sociedad de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid. En la actualidad es miembro del Grupo de Investigación Historia y Ontología del Presente, la perspectiva hispana, y del proyecto Constelaciones del autoritarismo, memoria y actualidad de una amenaza a la democracia en una perspectiva filosófica e interdisciplinar. Y su actividad investigadora y publicaciones se centran en la conceptualización de distintos momentos de la genealogía del presente. Y bueno, pues doy paso a Cristina.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas por estar aquí y especialmente quisiera agradecer a las organizadoras y a los organizadores por su trabajo y el cuidado que habéis puesto en la organización y bueno, a Anita, con la que estaba en contacto, por su amabilidad. Bueno, después de dar las gracias pues, por el cuidado y la amabilidad, ahora voy a hablar del mal y la competencia. No hay vida justa en lo falso, sentenciaba Adorno en Mínima Moralia, refiriéndose a la imposibilidad de alcanzar la justicia mediante una impoluta conducta moral individual, en las condiciones de lo que era el capitalismo tardío, es decir, en las condiciones en las que la integración social se realiza en el plano de relaciones formalmente iguales y equitativas, pero cuya condición de posibilidad son la reproducción de la dominación abstracta de capital, la explotación estructural, la manifestación fetichista de las mismas, etc. En este sentido, la expectativa de una vida particular justa sería una quimera o se aparece como una quimera poética. Que no haya vida justa en lo falso no sería una advertencia de la clausura de la emancipación, sino más bien de la dificultad de hacer justicia a través de la búsqueda de una conducta individual moralmente irreprochable. Pues esta aspiración, ¿no?, de la vida justa individual presupone que la acción justa está a disposición de la mera voluntad del sujeto individual y omite así las relaciones de dominación, desigualdad y exclusión que sostienen la integración social. Más aún, en esta llamada falsa sociedad, falsamente igual y libre, como he explicado, la supervivencia del sujeto, es decir, el acceso a la vivienda, al alimento, al apoyo, pero también al reconocimiento social, pasa por el imperativo de la competencia en el mercado laboral o empresarial e incluso, en la actualidad, en el acceso a la protección estatal. Esto condiciona las decisiones del sujeto, que se ven sometidas a opciones heterónomas y limitadas en función de su posición social. Devorar o ser devorado, otra cita de Adorno, no es por tanto una máxima normativa del comportamiento ni una disposición psíquica subjetiva, sino la encarnación del imperativo de la competencia, que se impone para la supervivencia, para las clases bajas, o para el mantenimiento del estatus social, clases medias o la élite, y se impone para supervivencia o el mantenimiento de estatus en las condiciones del capitalismo tardío. Esto, como decía, ni clausuraba la emancipación social ni tampoco descarga, no se trata de descargar al sujeto de la responsabilidad de la toma de conciencia o la participación en actividades colectivas de transformación social. De lo que se trata es de confrontarnos con que en la forma de sociabilidad invertida del capitalismo, es decir, donde prima o rige la acumulación de capital, la lógica, frente a lo que sería la satisfacción de necesidades, ¿no?, aunque sea de forma en su diversidad, hacer justicia no está a disposición de la mera voluntad individual, pues la libertad para hacer el bien o la autonomía para hacer justicia solo existen como decisiones entre opciones limitadas según la posición social en términos de clase, raza o género, como ya sabemos. Pero aunque el sujeto ni es libre para ser justo ni autónomo para ser bueno de manera absoluta, el neoliberalismo ha constituido una forma de juicio práctico, no un juicio moral, sino en la praxis sobre la conducta del sujeto en la medida en que la meritocracia actual no significa tanto, ¿no?, la gratificación del esfuerzo, sino la penalización del fracaso como responsabilidad individual. En este sentido, el neoliberalismo no ha hecho sino incrementar las condiciones de heteronomía e injusticia mediante las ya conocidas desregulación de mercados, especialmente laboral, mercantilización de las tareas de reproducción, la retirada del garantismo social y, en definitiva, el sometimiento o la extensión de los principios de rentabilidad y productividad a todos los ámbitos de la vida. Y pese a tal incremento de la, por decirlo así, heteronomía o no libertad, ha sido el neoliberalismo, ¿no?, ha instituido esta forma de tribunal impío e impersonal sobre el sujeto, haciéndole responsable de su propia exclusión, marginalidad o desclasamiento. Así se consuma realmente la competencia como principio rector de la conducta individual o institucional, desde lo que Dardot y Laval llamaron el giro definitivo hacia la Foucaultiana gubernamentalidad neoliberal en la década de los 80. Ya desde entonces la acción gubernamental ni aspira a igualar las oportunidades ni a asegurar la subsistencia de la población. En una situación de desempleo estructural, la crisis del trabajo actual, esto se traduce en la existencia de población sobrante, entre comillas, de una masa estructuralmente no empleable, desposeída y desheredada. Así, la actual movilidad social descendiente, además de amenazar a las clases más bajas con la marginalidad, lo hace también con las clases medias con la pérdida de estatus o el desclasamiento. En este marco se acucia el imperativo de la competencia para ser integrado en el mercado laboral, permanecer en él o emitir una factura si uno es autónomo. Por su parte, la clase media, la clase rentista o el gran capital no son ajenos, no están fuera de la competencia, pues aseguran su fortuna mediante la garantía de la reproducción de las condiciones de la desigualdad social, jurídica y política. En este sentido, el darwinismo social contemporáneo no es un simple producto de una creencia extendida de que solo los más aptos sobrevivan, sino de la existencia social de población sobrante, en el sentido que acabo de explicar. La existencia, por lo tanto, del cálculo estratégico, la racionalidad instrumental y de la depredación social, la competencia, impera en la medida en que el sujeto se ve obligado a participar de la lucha por el éxito o la excelencia en las formas mismas de integración social, pues en última instancia es juzgado como responsabilidad del individuo el fracaso y no como efecto de las herencias de capital simbólico, cultural o económico. En este sentido, la creciente incitación a la excelencia tiene como correlato para la mayor parte de la población que el éxito no se presenta sino como la posibilidad de esquivar el desclasamiento o la marginalidad, de garantizar temporalmente su subsistencia y la de su familia o el sueño de tener fortuna en el azar o en el juego. El modelo de subjetividad, entonces, del empresario de sí, ¿no?, que rige su conducta en todas las esferas de la vida según el modelo de la empresa, es decir, un cálculo estratégico racional de medios fines, no se generaliza por efecto de la mera persuasión mediática o ideológica, sino en estos modos propios de subjetivación neoliberales. Tras el deterioro de los derechos sociales, el trabajo asalariado garantizado y los lazos comunitarios, competir y asumir la responsabilidad de la gestión de su propia fortuna o miseria, ¿no?, es un hecho de facto que constituye el darwinismo social y que es lo que de alguna manera condiciona la interiorización de sus propios principios como la aceptación del daño, el sufrimiento de los otros. En este sentido, la amenaza existencial de desclasamiento o exclusión tiene como consecuencia una generalización de la impotencia y la incertidumbre, tanto como la privatización reiterada del reconocimiento del esfuerzo genera agravio y frustración. De ahí que la vivencia del miedo, el resentimiento y la rabia sean en última instancia consecuencias psicofísicas de los modos de socialización contemporánea. El sufrimiento que soporta el sujeto y la adaptación a las exigencias de la integración, daño a la autoestima, humillación, desasosiego, desconfianza, a menudo, y observamos en la actualidad, encuentra su compensación en formas de autoafirmación viril y narcisista, ¿no?, en formas, de autoafirmación despiadadas, a menudo expresiones agresivas de la rabia o certezas paranoicas, que es lo que constituye las formas actuales de comportamiento viril o narcisista. En este sentido, el empresario de sí, o más precisamente de su fuerza de trabajo, no constituye la realidad de los sujetos vivos, sino un modelo que se impone en las demandas sociales o laborales de adaptación flexible, racionalidad instrumental o búsqueda de la excelencia. Los sujetos vivos, en su concreción particular, tienen límites físicos, psíquicos y morales que, además de no permitirles adaptarse al comportamiento modélico del empresario en sí, constituyen su principal fuente de malestar. Las demandas de flexibilidad horaria, por ejemplo, ¿no?, o la hiperproductividad se encuentran con el síndrome del burnt out o el agotamiento del sujeto. Lo mismo pasa con las exigencias de competición y cálculo instrumental, que se encuentran con la existencia efectiva de afectos empáticos o vínculos solidarios. Entonces, el modelo del empresario de sí no rige sin causar malestar y daños subjetivos, que son el caldo de cultivo propicio para las tendencias autoritarias, la búsqueda de chivos expiatorios o el odio al diferente, o incluso estas creencias paranoicas, ¿no? Desde este punto de vista, que no haya vida justa en lo falso no quiere decir que los sujetos vivos no busquen justicia, verdad o venganza, sino más bien que en los marcos de la praxis contemporánea todos los sujetos pueden ser víctimas o verdugos. Y pueden serlo en dos sentidos: estructuralmente, ¿no?, como reproductores de las condiciones de dominación y explotación, pero también a nivel subjetivo, como individuos que las formas de integración no solo son dañados por la competencia, víctimas y el egocentrismo actuales, sino también susceptibles de actuar como depredadores o narcisistas. Con este carácter dual se perfilan los personajes de las series de las que ya he empezado a hablar, aunque las mencione ahora, American Crime y Little Fires Everywhere. La construcción fílmica aquí de los personajes condensa en un sujeto concreto, de manera plausible, aunque exagerada, el carácter dual, víctima-verdugo, al que aboca los condicionantes sociales como la desigualdad social, la búsqueda de la excelencia, la explotación, el maltrato, abuso sexual, la heteronormatividad, los modelos de maternidad o la protección de privilegios. La amenaza de ser devorado, nos muestra las series, induce a devorar como mecanismo defensivo o de adaptación, tanto como la falta de reconocimiento del esfuerzo o del agravio sentido, inducen a la autoafirmación viril. Visualizando esta situación a través de vidas particulares, las series construyen un entramado de daños padecidos y acometidos que funciona como metáfora de la sociedad contemporánea, donde es difícil hacer justicia a una supuesta víctima sin devenir verdugo. Así se retrata no simplemente el hecho conocido de que la normalidad neoliberal es patológica, ¿no?, produce ansiedad, estrés, depresión, sino también tendencialmente criminal, en el sentido en que produce virilidad, paranoia, narcisismo o indiferencia. Con un formato típico del género policial, que inicia la trama con un crimen que resolver y un orden de justicia que restablecer, esta serie rompe los tópicos del formato, en la medida que el sentido del avance de la trama no consiste en desvelar al verdadero culpable y hacer justicia con su castigo, sino en revelar la disolución de las responsabilidades en un complejo entramado de personajes, instituciones, situaciones y condiciones sociales. El despliegue de la narración descubre al espectador un rasgo trágico de las sociedades contemporáneas: el compulsivo deseo subjetivo de identificar un culpable absoluto en el que depositar la rabia y la frustración, cuyo castigo compense la impotencia. Pero la serie no satisface este deseo y además muestra la dimensión que decía trágica como desencadenante de una nueva escalada de daños que lo revelan ineficaz para lograr seguridad o justicia. El espectador de género policial se descubre compartiendo deseo frustrado de justicia con los personajes de la serie ante el crimen con el que se inician. Pero el desarrollo de la trama, o mejor dicho, porque el desarrollo de la trama muestra en realidad la necesidad que la necesidad de encontrar al criminal puede ser tan ciega que acabe en la identificación de un chivo expiatorio o desvelarse tan impotente que termine por crear una escalada de nuevos daños y nuevos crímenes. En el complejo entramado de responsabilidades diluidas que crea la serie, las víctimas absolutas se difuminan tanto como los culpables. No estamos ante una trama típica, ¿no?, policial, que consiste, se despliega un despliegue paulatino de pesquisas que enganchan al espectador para encontrar la identidad o el móvil del verdugo y que termina haciendo justicia, con un personaje, una institución heroica que contra todo restaura el orden. Esto es lo que los personajes como los espectadores desean aunque no lo quieran cuando comienza la serie, pero no se les concede ni en American Crime ni en Little Fights Everywhere. Y no se hace por un mero pesimismo caprichoso, no se satisface la necesidad objetiva del espectador neoliberal de identificación o compensación de la impotencia o de sensación de seguridad, ya que la trama consiste, como decía, en revelar las opciones de los personajes según sus condiciones sociales. Al mostrar la complejidad de las responsabilidades diluidas, la facilidad con que las vidas se truncan y la vulnerabilidad desesperada de algunos verdugos, ambas series nos confrontan precisamente con que la búsqueda ciega y obstinada del castigo conduce fácilmente a los personajes a cometer actos de venganza desproporcionados, a lanzarse contra chivos expiatorios o a la negación patológica de la propia responsabilidad. Si el daño nunca se repara en ninguna de las temporadas, es porque cada personaje concreto es víctima de las opciones que tiene según condiciones sociales, ¿no? En resumen, de clase, género y raza. Y si el espectador siente que no se hace justicia es porque resulta imposible, en tanto que la trama le obliga a conocer la crueldad de los condicionantes de cada vida particular. Es más, la satisfacción subjetiva de lo justo para un personaje resulta ser una ignominia para otros. Así, ninguna de las temporadas puede ofrecer al espectador lo que espera: culpable claro, reparación del daño, restauración del orden. Pero, sin embargo, estas series no constituyen una mera crítica del sistema judicial, aunque sí que muestran cómo reproduce la sociedad de clases a través de la discriminación de la pobreza, sino que va más allá señalando la imposibilidad de esa vida justa individual, las condiciones de desigualdad e hipercompetencia o competitividad que conforman las opciones reales de los individuos. Entre todos los personajes de la serie no encontramos ningún bueno absoluto que ocasionalmente no se comporte como un malvado, relativamente al menos. La posibilidad así de la identificación del espectador con personajes concretos, ¿no?, por astutos, honrados, buenos o carismáticos, es realmente difícil. En este sentido, más que una desesperación estéril, lo que ofrece la serie es un espejo de la impotencia del individuo aislado, aunque sea en la burbuja, en el marco familiar, en una sociedad selvática donde la ley del más apto es la que rige. Por ello, creo que no se trata tanto de llevar en las series al espectador a una desesperación a través de un desencarnado realismo pesimista, sino de tensar el género policíaco para señalar, a modo de advertencia social más que moral, que las compensaciones individuales a la impotencia solo crean más daño en una sociedad, por decirlo así, falsa. El castigo impío del culpable o chivo expiatorio que desatiende la realidad de los condicionantes expresa, en cierto modo, el peso que sobre los individuos ejerce el juicio neoliberal sobre la responsabilidad individual. Ello lleva a que la impotencia ante el agravio estructural se despliegue sobre los otros sin misericordia, especialmente cuando se cree en la existencia de un culpable que deviene así de nuevo la víctima propicia. No hay perdón para el loser ni indulgencia para el considerado culpable, excepto ocasionalmente en una institución central en la serie que es la familia, en la que no me puedo extender, pero sí decir que en la serie, si la familia deviene tan importante, series que hablan de la contemporaneidad, es porque en ella se manifiesta la carga neoliberal que supone el proceso de privatización de la reproducción de la vida con el retraimiento del garantismo social y también el peso que supone para las familias preparar a los hijos para la integración en la competencia. Además de cargar privativamente con las tareas del cuidado en la familia, y esto sabemos que produce una doble carga de trabajo para la mujer o la mercantilización del trabajo de cuidado a través de trabajadoras domésticas en condiciones muy precarias o en semiesclavitud. Además de eso, la familia constituye en las series y en el neoliberalismo el núcleo de seguridad económica, por decirlo así, donde se transmite el patrimonio junto con las oportunidades de partida, y también de inseguridad porque también se transmite el endeudamiento privado, ¿no?, respecto a la vivienda, la educación, etc. Así, las familias de clase media en crisis en las series presionan a la descendencia hacia la excelencia a cualquier precio o sacrificio, sin que el éxito siempre les premie, y esto se ve en la segunda temporada de American Crime. En la tercera se nos muestra algo más atroz. En el seno de las clases más desamparadas, la protección de la descendencia es mucho más complicada, puesto que en algunos casos las situaciones laborales o de estructuraciones familiares o los procesos migratorios dejan a la descendencia como única salida a la venta de su cuerpo o la economía informal. La vulnerabilidad se hereda como la deuda sin amparo ni protección. Las clases bajas no pueden aspirar ni al hábitus, ni a los contactos, ni a la competencia de la élite, excepto a través, lo muestra las series, de la losa del endeudamiento, del sacrificio vital. También en este estrato social a veces se transmite, por mor de la adaptación, la máxima de devorar o ser devorado, pero no a través de las impolutas, libres e iguales, o al menos amparadas institucionalmente, relaciones de libre mercado, sino en los marcos de mercados informales y de desamparo institucional. Cuando las series nos van desvelando esta última opción heredada entre matar o morir, metafóricamente, y no, en la serie, ¿no?, el espectador se ve conducido a percibir al criminal con condescendencia y sentir la impotencia de una vida truncada trágicamente desde sus condiciones de partida. En este sentido, si estas series no nos permiten tampoco odiar al criminal, es porque consiguen mostrar el modo en que sus posibilidades están condicionadas por su posición de clase, riqueza poseída o heredada, capital simbólico por las relaciones patriarcales, la forma en la que se impone la heteronormatividad o la condición racial vinculada a privilegios o trabas jurídicas, políticas y sociales. Pero en este sentido, las series no solo hacen evidente la ignominia neoliberal que responsabiliza al individuo de su fracaso, omitiendo las condiciones que condicionan la elección, sino también el hecho de que no todos son igualmente víctimas y verdugos, ni compadecen equitativamente ante el juicio. No todos soportan el mismo daño ni padecen la misma cantidad de sufrimiento, ¿no? Las clases más marginales son fácilmente elegidos como chivos expiatorios y presas de la criminalización de la pobreza. Su vulnerabilidad y estigma los aboca más fácilmente a los ilegalismos y a la competencia desregulada. Son los más dañados, pero no por ello, ya voy cerrando, se presentan en la serie como víctimas absolutas, puesto que no son ajenos al imperativo de la competencia. En este sentido, uno de los elementos más incómodos y fuertes de la serie es que, si bien retratan sin piedad los rasgos depredadores, cínicos y egocéntricos de las clases medias aspiracionales y de la élite, no dejan de hacerlo con los pobres, marginales y excluidos. Bajo la amenaza de exclusión y la lucha contra el débil, pueden verse también obligados a interiorizar la actitud viril. Y aquí vemos también la contrarevolución, o este viejo problema de la cuestión sobre cuáles son las condiciones sociales para la existencia de conciencia y solidaridad entre los oprimidos, que se expresa también en las modalidades de representación, en este caso de las series fílmicas, de los marginales y el efecto que ello produce sobre el espectador. Las 3 temporadas de American Crime muestran agresividad defensiva y competencia feroz y astucia indiferente entre los oprimidos, formas de odio y venganza entre ellos que dificultan la empatización del criminal con los oprimidos, pero también retratan formas de dignidad, honor, altruismo y empatía entre los más desamparados, que trascienden la línea de padres a hijos en formas de amistad, de solidaridad comunitaria o cierto apoyo mutuo. En estos momentos al espectador se le permite simpatizar con los personajes. Los momentos de altruismo, perdón, afecto son retratados con profundidad y cuidado. Y con esto se hace una concesión al deseo del espectador de una vida justa. Pero lo trágico es que esto no significa siempre para los personajes una justicia en sus vidas privadas. De esta forma se perfilan también los personajes en las series de David Simon, ¿no?, como The Wire, The Deuce o Tremé, donde en medio de un horror sociológico se retratan formas de dignidad que conmueven. Pues ahí la lucha por la supervivencia, pese a moverse los marcos de la picaresca o la ilegalidad, tiene todavía límites comunitarios y morales, ¿no? El debate sería qué tipo de representación de la opresión conduce o a la desesperación impotente o a la indignación social movilizadora. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, pues creo que ahora tenemos a nuestra tercera participante por internet. No sé si la vamos a ver en pantalla o vamos a ver su PowerPoint. Ok, Katy, hi. I hope you can hear me. I'm gonna read a bit her bio while I guess that she will appear with her PowerPoint. Oh, okay, sorry. So, Katy Deepwell is founder and editor of En Paradoxa, International Feminist Art Journal, and professor of contemporary art theory and criticism at Middlesex University, and she continues to run the Feminist Art Observatory. Her books include Feminist Art, Activism and Artivism, All Women Art Spaces in Europe in the Long 1970s, and some other books that you can find in the brochure. So let's start with Katy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry that I have to speak to you virtually and not in person. And I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to come and talk. So the key question of my talk is about the perversions of feminism in neoliberal thought and elements of their resistance in feminist artists' works. So I'm really focusing on the characterization and misrepresentation of feminist imaginaries in contemporary art. And I'm naming this as a kind of perversion of what I see as the principal reasons for the interventions of feminism. Now, in this talk, I'm going to use Nancy Fraser's very excellent critique, and it's a very complicated critique. So the first few minutes of my talk, I'm going to explain her critique of neoliberalism. And the time frame that she uses is different from the ones that have already been raised. She is talking about post-war settlement of liberalism in dominant Western economies and a post-neoliberalism which emerges in the 70s as a result of changes in the post-war settlement of Western democracies. So let me move. So her argument is in 5 stages. And it's important to say from the outset that neither a liberal social democracy nor neoliberal versions of it are fixed or complete systems of governments, nor are they simply stages in capitalism which exhaust the previous stage. They are strongly, in Foucauldian terms, dispositif, operationalized by individuals, practices, and institutions, and as such are ideological formations present in different forms today. And you can still find echoes of previous formations always present. Feminism's multiple criticisms of both state-managed capitalism, which she describes in these 4 features, which I've named 1, post-war state-managed capitalism, economism, androcentrism, etatism, and Westphalianism, she argued have been extensively critiqued by feminism in very particular ways. Well, academic consensus on the left continues to point to neoliberalism's pervasiveness and its conceptual elusiveness. The important point remains that reforms or counter-proposals to state-managed capitalism, like progressive taxation, social justice, and a living wage, never surface in neoliberal arguments. Neoliberal arguments prefer inequalities, competition in markets, and laissez-faire in decision-making, where only nudges or trends in markets determine social outcomes. The artworks that I'm going to discuss, having explained this model to you, are related to 2, 4, and 5. And I will come back to why these phases of feminist critique as 2, 4, and 5 are significant. This is because art identified as feminism is always informed by feminist politics. It is not just the gender of the artist as female. So to explain in more detail, in Fortunes of Feminism, Fraser argues that these 4 features of post-war state-managed capitalism were central to second wave feminism's emergence. Feminist critique contra state-managed capitalism was centered on sex segregation in the labor market, a critique of patriarchy in welfare systems and labor policies based on the presumption of a family wage by a male breadwinner, aka the nuclear family, a critique of sexism in governance, discriminatory practices in institutions and everyday life, and androcentric or patriarchal nationalisms, even in post-colonial states, alongside the First World's continual colonialist strategies and the terrible legacies of these in most developing countries. Feminism, like state-managed capitalism, centered on questions about redistribution of wealth, but added to this questions about the underrepresentation of women in education, health, politics, the labor market, and the arts, repeatedly linking gender to analysis of economics, politics, and society. Feminism redefined the personal as political in state-managed capitalism as a management not just of work, but also the private sphere through welfare. Gender was polarized in a binary, male and female, as political actors, but it was not just a politics about women's bodies, but citizenship, identity, work patterns, environment, war, as well as the stereotyping of women into limited roles, notably mothers and housewives. Fraser's key arguments is that feminism's critique of these features of state-managed capitalism, which have produced women as second-class citizens at work, in political life, and the nuclear family, emerged at the very moment at which capitalism itself was undergoing a transformation. If state-managed capitalism had redistribution as its goal to appease worker discontent, neoliberalism here in 3 offered a narrow economic-led focus on markets and privatization that placed both the individual as responsible for themselves and a certain type of performative self-management in the foreground. While neoliberalism set out to reduce state responsibilities for welfare provision, transferring this onto charities and NGOs, its deregulation of markets added to administration and bureaucracy in everyday life, managed largely by private individuals or unaccountable companies or quangos. Fraser argues that neoliberalism's critique of the family as a unit, named in 3, given its focus on all individuals as contributors to and beneficiaries of markets, came close to aspects of feminist responses to a patriarchal and over-bureaucratic welfare state. She argues that both what I have named 3 and 4 have resulted in liberal as well as neoliberal claims for how and where workers work or spend their wages as self-employed and freelance agents as a question of emancipation or freedom. This is because feminist claims have been thoroughly resignified in 4 into a question about freedom of choice and even a neoliberal moral order about freedom to choose, which has actually depressed wages further for the majority. While women have entered the wage labour market in ever greater numbers post-war, this resignification of feminism in neoliberal public discourse performs only lip service in defense of women's rights because they are actually being eroded, or sings the mantra of women in decision-making positions, which can only ever be reserved for an elite of women. Fraser is especially critical of the emphasis on representation and identity politics in this resignification of feminism as choice and emancipatory, because misrecognition and misrepresentation have dominated the debate since the 2000s. And as she argues, feminists thought less about economics or the political overdeterminations that generate women's plural and unequal situations in the world. Throughout her argument, Fraser makes important, sharp distinctions between liberal feminisms and other variants of feminism, socialist feminism, Black feminist, third world and post-colonial feminisms. Her critique of the narrow scope of liberal feminism's focus on equality, and now resignified as freedom to choose, does not repeat most left-wing dismissals of feminisms, namely that it that liberal feminism can only be reformist and leave the fundamental structures of androcentric versions of capitalism untouched. Feminism in other modes, socialist, black, third world, and post-colonial, continues with this emphasis on a fundamental rethinking of the structures of androcentric versions of capitalism. This criticism underlines her calls for a transnational coalition of feminists as an alternative, which I hope you can see, but it's covered by the screen. I have named as 5. I'm just going to move it out of the way. Okay, which is an alternative feminist scenario, which is anti-neoliberal, anti-economism, anti-neoliberal, anti-androcentrism, and anti-neoliberal, anti-estatism, etc. And the purpose of this is to fundamentally rethink how capitalism could be completely taken apart, and we could think completely differently about both care work and housework. And this model underpins her version of feminist coalition politics for the 99% against the neoliberalist global centralization of wealth for the 1%. There are plenty of alternative models around for thinking about this. Another economic model is about a rethinking of capitalism away from simply a focus on wage labor and production to thinking about fundamental systems of human exchange, both formal and informal, concerning money and not concerning money. And this repeats the reproduction arguments that feminism has been so keen to emphasize, away from simply a focus on production and consumption. Fraser's work arises from her work on Foucault, and the argument about these 5 phases as dispositif is something that is very clear in her overall analysis. And this is why I am trying to show you now the versions of feminist and works by women artists which represent 2, 4, and 5 in this model. I'm not illustrating her theory in art, but I am trying to argue that the works I've identified and selected are representative of the position she identifies. The confusions and misrecognitions attributed to them are useful as a way of extending our arguments about how feminism is misrepresented. So I just wanted to say a few other things about feminist analysis, which has tried to point also to the very strong difference between neoliberal configurations and neoconservative thinking. For example, Wendy Brown. And this is most evident in the ways in which neoconservative thinking appeals to traditional morality, supporting self and family. But neoliberalism really is not interested in this traditional morality at all. Instead, it only advances a 2-income family model. 2-income, it doesn't matter if it's pink power or heterosexual family arrangements. What this model tends to do as neoliberalism is argue that everything in life can be traded as objects for economic consumption, and all human practices have a price and a value which can be competitively determined in the market. Other people like Melinda Cooper, who Wendy Brown also borrows from, have pointed in this respect to the irony of marriage as if it was a modern state solution to homophobia, given the hundreds of years of feminist critique of this social institution for women and the continuing discrimination against women who have caring responsibilities in the labour market and caring for parents and elderly relatives, not just for children. The art market, for example, shows no interest in artworks by women which are about mother's experience. They only want Madonnas and parenthood in homosexual couples as provocative curiosities, nothing to do with lived experiences of the human population. Now, with over 50 years of feminist art production, it's important to state that feminism itself as a movement of, by, and for women remains a truly global phenomenon. It is not an art style, nor a type of work, nor is it simply found in the subjectivity of a gendered person named woman as an intention. In the 90s, it was possible to discern very clear feminist responses to neoliberalism, particularly in Eastern Europe and Asia, undergoing the sharp economic shock of post-socialism or economic neoliberalization from different forms of state-managed capitalism. But feminism in the West had also been changed by the backlash driven by the reactionary and neoliberal economic policies of the Reagan-Thatcher era of the 90s. So the question is, who are the winners or losers in neoliberal economics? And this is my first example, which is Kai Kaljo's Loser. In this video, the artist tells us how much she weighs, that she is 37 and still lives with her mother, that she earns $90 per month as a teacher at the Estonian Art Academy. And interspersed between these statements is a canned soundtrack of laughter that was common in Western sitcoms, but was a novelty in Eastern Europe. Kaljo looks like an economic loser, struggling in a ridiculous situation for the West, who callously and mechanically laugh at the poverty it has produced in post-socialism. But given the immediate aftermath of post-socialist independence in Estonia, it is ironically this work that made her a winner in the art world, leading to a successful establishment as an artist internationally and representation by Western galleries. In 2011, Anna Stina Tremund remade this work, reversing the gender roles, as the artist dressed up as 4 different economically successful men to point to other outcomes of Estonia's post-socialist recovery. As a promotion material for this video states, Martin has 3 children with different women. He believes in marriage. Veiko works in Finland but hates immigrants. And Lori is a closeted homophobe. The expected values of Estonian citizens are nationalist and discriminative. Anyone different, not white, Estonian speaking, straight, and with children, is under pressure to become normal Estonian, making more Estonian babies and go to a song celebration. The laughter here pitches its gender-bending and queer irony in a joke that now the audience must share. If Kaljo offers a feminist critique of the effects on real lives of state-managed and neoliberal modes of capitalism, and the constrained position of art and its undervaluation of education in neoliberal Estonian politics, Tremund depends on the performative representational aspects of the attitudes of the men she parodies, and this becomes Fraser's fourth resignification of feminism. To find an example of 5, I would suggest Mari Trala's short video, The Heroine of Post-Socialist Labour, which parodies its succession of images, both the noble mythology of the industrial worker in socialism as a heroine of the socialist labour, to its new post-socialist model as the exercise and consumer-obsessed office post-industrial worker. But she emphasizes how both myths are myths to which women conform. All, it seems, are costumes that can be adopted, as the washing line of playful outfits suggests. We are seeing in all cases the stereotypes of wage labour, the socialist heroine, the neoliberal post-socialist double resignified. But the critique is that even though value systems have changed, the conformism of women to the system has not. And this is the feminist argument of the piece. Now, there are many complex investigations of the labour market in feminist works, largely in video or photography. Coco Fusco's Dolores from 10 to 10 reconstructs the oppressive surveillance, intimidation, and sexual harassment and violence against women workers in maquiladoras on the Mexican-US border. It's based on news reports. Using Fraser's distinction between 2 and 4, perhaps we might see Chow Fei's Whose Utopia in a completely different light. As an enactment of the impossible but imaginary fantasy of dance, through the workplace in the minds of post-industrial workers. They still work in factories, as the resignification of neoliberal values. This is a perfect example of workers individualistically seeking solace in leisure, and it posits individual freedom in a highly constrained and disciplined workspace. So perhaps too, we could think differently about the contrast between Ursula Beeman's Performing the Border for its postmodern riff on feminist documentary, with its steady identification of sexualized labor from maquiladora factories into the sex trade as an economic survival mode, combined with the high risk of becoming murder victims hidden on the outskirts of the city. As an example of two, it clearly has feminist elements in how the story is told and the issues presented. In contrast, Mika Rothenberg's films of women workers selling goods in export centers set up near Hong Kong to sell Chinese plastic goods around the world cover a neoliberal economy quite differently. Could this be an example of four, resignifying its meanings? The sheer boredom of this world aligned with artificial and superficial quality of these goods point to the realities of the new neo-global economy and China's own investment in export markets. So Fraser's distinction here between work signifying two and signifying four, a feminist critique and its resignification as a sign of neoliberalist consumption, is very relevant. In Emily Jassier's My America, the artist bought on credit luxury goods only to photograph and return them. The purchasing power of the credit card and its value as an exchange, signifying the construction of a fantasy about owning these goods in a free America, that great capitalist economy for every newly arrived immigrant was the point of the piece. Contrast this with Carrie Young's Inventory, which materializes her own body as raw materials into their combined stock market price. Is this stock market price the true price of a woman's worth? We know women's bodies are regularly for sale. Women sell their bodies, not just their labor globally, and not just in the sex trade, but in marriage. Both traditionally in countries where they are exchanged between men for money or between families for money, but in their own willing, internet-led and self-declared attempts to become foreign brides for that better economic life. Tanya Ostojich's performance recorded here highlights this market as a woman's aspiration to become and hold an EU passport. Contrast this with Orland's Kiss the Artist, where Orland sold her own kisses for 5 francs to anyone. The context at FIAC, an art fair, reinforces how women's bodies are still used and sold as myth and fiction in art, even as she attempted to engineer or intervene in this economy by setting up her own intervention. So using Fraser's analysis, are these both 2 or 2 and 4, or 2 and possibly 5 in the feminist critique of Tanya Ostojich? In Martha Rosler reads Vogue, made at the height of Reagan's presidency, it is very clear in the filmic monologue how the magazine Vogue sells desire, aspiration, narcissism, the allure of women's bodies as a photographic exercise in fascination. And I'm quoting here, in the look, the pose, the skin of luxury, where glamour, excitement, romance, drama combined, Rosler points to the hunt, the drama, the animalism, the triumph, the power that the women photographed are made to represent in their bodies, in lieu of and in contrast to owning real power, luxury, wealth, and prestige. Reporting on how Vogue's owner, Condé Nast, favored sex with uninhibited enthusiasm and poured this idea into the content of the magazine, the film ends with a strong contrast in the footage of Asian women working in the rag trade in New York, while Martha herself puts on makeup, joining the seduction, emphasizing the complicity of consumption embedded in all our social and economic desires. How different this is as an ideological critique from the deadpan presentation of naked, semi-naked women in B-Cross performances. The models are asked to pose as bored, avoid the gaze, and to signify that they are only bodies. As such, they become robots in a new factory of her production line, no longer models, not themselves, but unified by their wig and underwear. This is a neoliberal resignification of women's bodies, and the success of the artist as producer depends on the art world's expectation that woman equals model equals great art. The choice to act in this way marks Beecroft's own endorsements of neoliberal business, evident in her work for Kanye West, for a place where race is just a color, a mutable chosen identification, not a life experience. If conservatives use neoliberal economics to project the household as the embodiment of personal wealth, physical security, the unit at the heart of community, the place of bonds, personal pride, and as a territory to be defended, the absence of a man in this unit is regarded as a social stigma, even when the numbers of one-parent families, largely women, female-headed households, continues to rise. Poverty, their poverty in particular, is regarded as a personal failure, and their dependence an economic burden on the state. Yet neoliberal economics have left women overwhelmingly as carers and lone parents because of men's work as migrant labourers. How can we pretend not to know what we know internationally, as Adrian Piper's work demonstrates? Motherhood is a constant, but as a system of hypocritical values, it is polarized between excessive reverence and pity. The revolution of rights for women is now supposedly a problem only for the rest of the world, those poor developing countries with different religious traditions, superstitions, and hypocritical cant about women's place or role in the family. It is girls or children in developing countries who need protection or help, because the participation of women at all levels of the workplace must be encouraged, and it has been won in the West. Why does neoliberalism reify the cult of Madonnas again? This photo was a primary artistic result of Beecroft's African adventure and her failed attempt to adopt two African twins from an orphanage, the result of an extension of her own family abroad, her personal work to change lives. Why not lean in, work harder, become empowered, build both career and family? Don't let anyone stop you in your goals for greater self-realization. Become a great networker, maintain your social profile, focus on your performance, dress for success, be assertive, celebrate your life achievements, and document yourself and moods every day. One woman's success reflects on all possibilities for women, doesn't it? Feminism has not just critiqued the nuclear family, which less than 20 to 30% of the world's households actually are, to underline how the nuclear family is redesigned as demands from kids, as potential adults in the market. Consider Charles Ray's family romance. It tried to envisage difference differently. Petzold's 21st century vision of the last family in the 21st century might strike us as strange today, or even perhaps as an affirmation of queer subjectivity, but it was an attempt to show a radically different vision of where global mediatization might lead us. It was a dystopian vision of the future. The two women sit disconnected on a sofa, each in their own world, two women and two dogs staring at an empty TV screen. No reproduction is shown, and they cannot see each other. So feminist critique has been pointing to these processes of subjectification and exploitation since the 1960s, and the double bind of being enunciated and subject to technical machines and state apparatuses. The notion, the entrepreneur of oneself, as a perfectible end product of capitalism and patriarchy, was the starting point of feminism's analysis of our subjectification and subjection. Liberation arises as a part out of this, starting with consciousness of being caught in these dispositive ideological formations and patterns of behavior. States of what is are then transformed into what might be or could be another future, another way of living, away from how it was normatively ought to be. So I'm going to finish with this final example. Neoliberalism's message is that everyone must performatively work on themselves to make it in the marketplace, redesign themselves in entrepreneurial, opportunistic and risk-taking manners. Carrie Young's I'm a Revolutionary, in a performance where she paid and worked with a voice coach to learn to say repeatedly these words in a convincing manner, highlights this intense ambivalence. She is training herself in a manner sustained by the new neoliberal economy of service work to say these words convincingly at a moment at which they lack meaning. Its very ambivalence is this sign of resignification of feminism by neoliberalism suggested in Fraser's model. I want to contrast this with an example of what I see as Phi, which is Sanyo Vekovic's piece for Document 14, which consisted of two elements. The first was a partial reconstruction by Sanyo Vekovic of the Monument to the Revolution in 1926, which was made for the Central Cemetery in Friedrichsfeld in Berlin, in memory of the murdered Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, who were victims of the Reichstag riots. Ivekovic remarked this space, a red wall, a platform, built in Avid Square in Athens, as a place for political exchange. The second part of the piece was a soundtrack, Art of the Possible, towards an anti-fascist feminist front, a sound recording playing in the space, uttered by numerous women from all over the world, curated by art theorists and Angela Dimitrikaki and Antonio Mayaka, as a collaboration with Sanyo Vekovic. The square was also used to organize events and protest meetings.
Katy?
So it opened a space. It wasn't just a complete work.
Katy?
I'm finishing now.
Okay, we really need to finish.
Yes, this is the last sentence, and this is a list of all the people who spoke. And the sound file was compiled. So feminism's original critique needs to be reclaimed and turned towards other ends, decentering the family wage, revalorizing unwaged labor, including unpaid caring roles, and disrupting the current status quo based on masculinist cultural values. Choice in a market as a consumer is not the same as an exercise of a fundamental right of a citizen or the human rights of everyone in the world to health, security, and education, regardless of their citizenship. That's the end.
Thank you. Creo que podemos tener un poco de... No, ya lo sé, ya, pero vamos a establecer un poco el marco. Entonces, ¿nos queda tiempo para preguntas, para comentarios? O sea, 10 minutos. Okay, Katy, we have 10 minutes. If any question come to you, maybe you can answer, and maybe I can try to translate, but first, ¿hay alguna pregunta? Si no, o sea, yo entiendo que la mesa es muy variada. Como decía, está un poco montada a partir como de 3 casos muy distintos que provienen del ámbito soviético, del ámbito del feminismo y de, vamos a llamarlo, la meritocracia neoliberal. Pero bueno, yo creo que son 3 puntos que, a pesar de que parezcan totalmente opuestos, me he hecho yo aquí un recorrido tratando de hilarlo, ¿no? Para darle una cierta coherencia. Y bueno, sobre todo creo que las tres intervenciones están basadas en la contradicción, ¿no? En esas contradicciones que se generan entre lo que seduce o la promesa que el neoliberalismo traía y luego lo que llega de verdad. Una promesa que también estoy un poco como recogiendo palabras de todas las intervenciones que está basada o que está articulada en torno a una perversión, que también es algo que ha dicho Katy, y en este proceso de subjetivación y que lleva a que haya a que la subjetividad se conforme en torno a esta contradicción, a esta falla que es perversa y que trata siempre de compensar algo de la impotencia, ¿no? Un poco la línea que decía Cristina, o de repararse. Entonces, bueno, creo que los hitos así un poco para hablar de la contrarevolución serían lo contemporáneo en el caso de Angela, lo viril en el caso de Cristina y los puntos ciegos que tiene el feminismo neoliberal. Y por acabar, ¿no? En qué es lo que a qué apuntan esas contradicciones, lo sabemos, pero hacia dónde quizá se está mirando como bajo la idea de fantasma en todos los casos, quién sería ese sujeto que se está intentando como reprimir, pues podría ser, por ejemplo, el legado soviético, el legado bolchevique, o la lucha de clases, o un feminismo antiliberal, ¿no? Como esos sujetos que pueden emerger como fantasmas para deshacer algunas de estas contradicciones y impotencias, ¿no? Entonces, no sé si a partir de esta, así como hilo conductor que he marcado, tenéis algún comentario a esto o tenemos alguna pregunta y si hay alguna para Katy, pues yo creo que se la podemos... Creo que a través de los micrófonos ella la podría oír. No questions. Any comments? I can figure out some questions.
May I ask a question to Kathy?
Yeah.
Kathy, can you hear? Hi, this is Angela. Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, I mean, you brought up this example of artistic strategies that point at a certain critique of neoliberalism and its sexual politics, let's call it that way. I was wondering if there is a name for, or is there an outside that you think that is imagined by this project? How would you name it politically? Are these strategies of resistance, or there is also something affirmative that you think politically and aesthetically could be discerned or can emerge? Thank you.
I was really focusing on the critique of labour because too often how women's work is thought about is very impoverished in discussions of neoliberalism, and this constant fight between production and reproduction. It's always seen like women are on the side of reproduction. They're not in the workplace. So I deliberately chose examples which are about work and protest. I think that you could find plenty of other kinds of strategies of resistance which you might prefer, which might be abstract or to do with subjectivities or to do with emotional states of being, which wouldn't necessarily point at labour so directly as the examples that I selected. I don't think there's an outside. We're all in ideology. I just don't believe there's any outside. I think we have to look quite carefully at our own complicities in the system. So I don't see that there is some neutral position outside these 5 positions that Fraser outlines. What we actually have to think about is political actions which we're invested in to change things.
Thank you. I have a question for Angela. And so my question is regarding, do you hear me?
Sí, está funcionando.
The mask, the thing, I mean. I was wondering, you did your presentation in this tension that Olga was talking about with the Stalinist past and something that is already dead, no? And this process of the perestroika, the new contemporaneity. And so I was wondering how does the parameter of nationalism plays in your analysis? Because in post-socialist times, all this, when the Soviet Union yeah? So collapse, yes, collapse. There is at the same time, yes, this this contraposition against this like Soviet past, but there is a strong nationalist construction of the nation that appears. And so I wonder, there were the Kardashians at the end, but could you say something about what this parameter, how it plays in your examples, or how it plays today in Russia, for example, with Putin waking, no, some of the old legacies, no? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Paula. I don't think that nationalism suddenly sprang in the 90s as the Soviet Union was collapsing, and the ideology of a big happy brotherhood led by Russia was also falling apart. I think, in a sense, from a kind of a Soviet perspective, the specific form of nationalism that showed itself in the public sphere, in the public discourse in the 90s was, I mean, was also, in a sense, can be traced to a Stalinist construction of the nation that became attached to a category of ethnicity and ethnic belonging. If the earlier Bolsheviks of the 1920s were walking kind of on a fine line and combining class liberation with the liberation of self-determination of nations, and seeing nations as a nation as a historically, possibly historically surpassable form, but a necessary form that is coupled with the liberation of class. What Stalinism already in the 30s implements at the level of the ideology is an institution of a concept of a nation, notion of a nation attached to an ethnic belonging, and Russia functioning as the guarantor, right, of the coexistence of nation understood as ethnicity. So I think it is this model that was coupled in the 90s as with a perhaps ideological understanding that nation has been suppressed and has to come back, kind of a pre-Soviet nation has been suppressed. But this is precisely a form of nationalism that imagines that there is a pre-Soviet nation form that needs to re-emerge, which again I attribute to the long processes of Stalinism and its reverberations in the throughout Soviet history. Just like, not to go on and on, in Armenia particularly, nationalism entered public discourse before the 80s. In the 1960s, in the aftermath of Khrushchev's liberalization program, but also because so many Armenians repatriated in the post-war period from the diaspora, who were the survivors of the genocide, and they brought in nationalism into the public discourse, into the public sphere, even before the perestroika, with a commemoration of the genocide and the attached discourses. So nationalism appears as the other of Soviet ideology, but I think it's not. It's part and parcel of the Stalinist legacy as such.
Bueno, creo que tenemos que acabar ahora. Hay 10. Volvemos a 1:30. Vale, hemos acortado un poco el break. Pues gracias.